Hello and welcome to episode 103 of The Dive Down, a Magic the Gathering podcast focused on the latest decks, trends, and strategies for the casual spike. My name is Stanislav here in Chicago, and with me on the line from Denver, Colorado, one and only Shane Beeps.
It's me, Shane Beeps, on the line from Denver, Colorado, where it's snowing. Dave, did you want to know?
Not everyone has to do musicals at the holidays time. I just want to be clear. Not every property suddenly becomes a musical property. Are we clear on that? Because I'm not doing a solo for you.
Yes, you are. You're singing a song. You're singing Magic the Gathering all night long.
No.
103
Okay,
episodes. We finally got Dave to sing.
I thought Maria and Megan over at formerly Magic the Amateuring. I actually forgot the new name of the podcast.
Good luck, high five.
Good luck, high five. They have semi-frequent musical episodes, so we can't possibly even imitate that.
No.
Stan, it's good to see you. Dave, it's good to see you.
You too. Let's do this. Let's roll that beautiful bean footage. Yep.
On this week's episode, we're getting better at Historic. We're qualifying for tournaments. We're crushing events. Shane's playing in his car on cross-country road trips. We're talking about the metagame, insights from recent tournaments, and our own experiences testing out some new-to-us decks that we've had our eyes on. But first, some housekeeping. Shout out to the new patrons to join the Dive Down Nation this week. We got another Michael S., the third Michael S. that I'm aware of. We also got another Joe, though this is a Joe S. No relation to Joe or the Michaels. As well as a third patron, Elusive Fate.
Ooh. I know what you did last summer. That's what that says to me. They found out what I did last summer.
Of course, a special shout out to Darth Dog for increasing their support tier. Thank you so much for going up a tier in your Patreon membership. We also got some new reviews from Yay2727 and JJ Streezy.
Oh, man, I love new reviews. I love new review week when people come in and they're like, "Oh, I love this podcast. You guys are the best." And I'm like, "Oh, yeah, just shoot that. Just let me swallow that pill of inflated ego."
Are those prescription only, or?
No, it's over the counter.
But you have to show your ID when you buy them. Like the pharmacist keeps track of how many they sell every year so that you don't make counterfeit decks out of it. We should probably do some plugs too. There's a bunch of ways to support the show. We even have a new vanity URL for one of these ways to support the show. So if you go over to untapped.thedivedown.com, it'll redirect you over to our untapped.gg support page, our affiliate link.
Yep, they call it a subdomain in the industry. So that's what we did.
Yeah, so if you play Magic Arena and you like tracking your stats, if you want to see how you're doing with certain decks, about how you're doing over the season, over multiple months, and the entire the sets and whatnot, you can download that, and you should be using that because it's awesome and it's fun to see what you're doing. And also, if you download it for the first time, you don't have to spend anything, you don't have to sign up for any service, you don't have to do anything crazy. All you gotta do is download it, and we get a little bit of a kickback. We all like and use Untapped, so we're telling you to do something that we think is worthwhile. So check it out. It's a good way to help us out without even spending anything.
And if you want to support us while you're playing Magic on Magic Online, check out manatraders.com to rent cards for the decks that you want to play. Manatraders.com is a great service. We've used it for a long time on Moto for playing Modern. And if you use code The Dive Down, all one word, when you sign up, you will get 15% off your first 3 months of subscription. It's manatraders.com.
Whenever we talk about that, I always go to Manatraders and I'm like, do I still have 75 cards checked out for the past week, something like that? And then finally, the most direct way to support us is with our Patreon. You can head over to patreon.com/thedivedown. $1 a week is the basic citizenship level, gets you into the super secret Slack server, which is honestly, that's all you really need. I mean, the other stuff's cool, but the Slack is growing regularly. It's awesome. Everyone that comes in has been an awesome addition. You know what I mean? I love when we get new people because they're always great to have in the community. And they add something new. They add a new perspective. I love having new voices. I love having new people who are oh, I'm playing this. I'm I didn't even know this was a deck. This is sweet. So it's definitely my favorite place to talk about Magic. The only place I talk about Magic, honestly.
Yeah, and it's not just people talking about Modern. As it turns out, there's actually a thriving EDH community within the Dive Down community as well, where they, it's one of the busiest channels on our Slack server. So if you want to come and talk about just all the different ways you like to play Magic, even if you discovered us because of Modern or because of Historic or Pioneer or whatever, there's just a lot of really enthusiastic Magic fans on our server.
Do you guys moderate that EDH channel? Because I never go there, and for all I know, it is lawless.
That's the Wild West.
I really like to pop in there I check it probably once a day. I pop in just to see what's going on, and it is an incredible different language. I feel like I've stepped into a completely different game most of the time when I pop there. I'm like, oh, are those Magic cards? Are those still Magic cards?
Apparently Judge Jack is in there. I trust him to moderate
and Joe,
everything.
Of course. Yes, you do.
I don't trust Joe to moderate anything.
Hilarious. All right. So yeah, the Slack is awesome. It's the best way to get into our weekly FNMs. We're now doing them basically every week. We have a bunch of awesome TOs. We got Ben, we got Bob, we got Trevor. We got a historic FNM this Friday. We just did a modern FNM this past Friday. Oftentimes lists from our tournaments end up on MTG Goldfish, but that's pretty cool. It's kind of like IMDb, but for Magic players. Am I wrong?
How often do you check IMDb?
For myself, all the time.
Oh my gosh. Every time I'm watching anything.
Yeah.
Stan's like, where are my producer credits?
All right. That was fun.
Stan, not to rush us, but I believe you're at the news desk this week.
That's right. And we have a lot to talk about because we're going to cover 8 events featuring 760 results. And it's just a single weekend worth of SCG Tour Satellite Tournaments.
So we really wanted to build off of the 100 decks that we dived into for our 100th episode. So we're going to dive into 760 historic decks today. Are you strap in, Twitch chat? We're doing it.
Yeah, Dave, oil the bell.
Oh, yeah. This bell is ready to go.
Get some WD-40.
Yeah.
That's not a lubricant, Stan.
WD-40 is not a lubricant?
No, it's a cleaner.
Unreal.
Earth shattered. All right. So for those of you who don't know or haven't heard, satellites are open events, meaning that anyone can participate, and they take place on select Fridays and Saturdays, hosted by Star City Games. And you participate in these satellite events to earn an invitation to compete in a 5K championship qualifier tournament that always happens this Sunday immediately after the satellites. So we had some tournaments on Friday and Saturday of this last weekend, and then there's another one that following Sunday. Depending on how you finish, you can also get buys in the qualifiers, and then you can even qualify for a big Kaldheim qualifier weekend if you participate in this season's SCG Satellite Tournaments. I gotta say, when I found out how much it cost to play in these satellites, I was sort of kicking myself for not participating in them sooner. There's 6 rounds of Swiss, and they cost $6 to enter.
That's a deal.
It is a deal. There is a cost. You have to only play on Arena. They're either standard or historic events. They don't do Moto. They don't do spell table cards. It's just Arena tournaments. But anyone with a 4-2 record or better qualifies for the Sunday event. And for this episode, we looked at the 8 historic satellite events that took place on the 11th and 12th of December. And then rather than going through each tournament one by one, because that would take forever, we collected all their data into a single beautiful pivot table. And we'll discuss the decks present from the event, some overall metagame representation from the weekend.
I just opened the pivot table and it is stunning. Stan, I just want to commend you on your work this week. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to kick us off, let's talk really quick about the handful of decks that actually went undefeated in these 8 events. Since turnout was so high, in some cases, multiple decks were able to go 6-0 in the course of a single satellite tournament, because some of these tournaments had over 100 players.
Wow, that's incredible. That's a ton of people.
It's huge. I think Arena is popping.
Wow.
So I'll run through these pretty quickly, and then we can discuss. Satellite 1, Sultai midrange and blue-green Kinnan combo.
I believe that's Simic, right? Blue-green,
yeah.
Stan?
Mm-hmm.
I'll call it Simic Kinnan from now on.
Please do.
Satellite 2, mono-red aggro and Rack-Sack went undefeated. Satellite 3, mono-red aggro and Rack-Sack went undefeated again. Satellite 4, Sultai midrange, only undefeated deck. Satellite 5, Simic Kinnan was the only undefeated deck. Satellite 6, Goblins, was the only undefeated deck. On the 7th night of Satellite, Sultai Midrange and Azorius Control went undefeated. And then on the 8th and final tournament, 2 copies of Rack Sack. So in total, we're looking at 4 Rack Sacks, 3 Sultai, 2 Kinnan, 2 Mono Red, 1 Goblins, and 1 Azorius Control.
Wow.
I imagine we'll talk about this a little bit later, but the Kinnan deck, is that like the Paradox Engine one we talked about like 2 weeks ago?
Yes.
It's not a new Kinnan build?
No.
Okay, sweet. It's a good amount of decks. It's kind of like what I expect, right? Like, besides the lack of goblins, I kind of wonder what's going on with that. Like, I mean, the goblins is only statistically a little bit unfavored versus like the sack decks. It's like favored versus Sultai. I think it's interesting that it does have a bad win rate against mono red. And in this more open environment where people are limited by their arena budgets a little bit, like me, I mean, mono red's not cheap. There's a good amount of mythics in mono red, but I mean, maybe like the people who really like just playing the fastest and like sort of easiest to build aggro deck on, they're bringing out mono red, and it has a little bit of a positive matchup against goblins, so maybe that kept it down a little bit.
Dave? And your reactions?
No, I think this is kind of what I would expect. There's nothing new in here. There's other. I mean, the Kinnan deck is pretty new in a lot of ways, so we'll talk about that in a little bit. But yeah, this is the historic metagame, y'all.
Just to clarify, these are only decks that went 6-0, but if we look at the total count, 760 decks, here's a quick breakdown of how that pie chart looks. The most represented deck, 249 copies, Uro midrange.
Whoa! 33% of the, how many decks did you say? 700?
760 in total.
Wow. Okay.
People love that mid-range.
God, they love that Uro, yeah.
In second place in popularity was Goblins, 110 copies, 14.6%. Yeah, and those
Field did bring the goblins.
Sorry to interrupt, but those two decks are basically 50%, give or take.
Yeah, that's pretty wild. I mean, I'm kind of jumping ahead, but like we've sort of just said that the three, well, it's been kind of insinuated or kind of believed that the 3 pillars are like what, Simic, Goblins, and like Racksack or Junsack, right? But it's interesting what you're going to talk about in the next few slots that I think is like, oh, is this the shifting meta, or is this kind of like the big brain tournament meta that's coming up next?
So I think what you're alluding to, Shane, is that the third most popular deck, 60 copies and 7.9%, Azorius Control.
Yeah, I mean, you come off hot off a tournament win at the Zendikar Rising Champs, and people are going to be like, oh, is there a legitimate control deck I could be playing? Must play Azorius Control.
And we'll talk about this more later, but I definitely saw a good amount of Azorius Control in the open.
Up next, which I guess is actually bigger than Azorius Control, is Sacrifice. Because if you bucket Jund and Rakdos, you're looking at 68 copies. So that's what, like 10%?
9%.
Yeah. I mean, then that's still following kind of what Shane said we thought the 3 pillars of the format were in a lot of ways. It's interesting to me that the Jund versus Rakdos discussion is continuing on the Sacrifice deck, and I'll have more to talk about later, as this is a deck that I played a lot over the last couple of weeks. But it's interesting how similar and how different these 2 decks are, because like I have the Rakdos Sacrifice deck, and if I wanted to switch over to Jund, it would cost me another 25 rare tickets or something, rare wilds or something like that, because of the mana base and to get a hold of enough collected companies. But that's really the only difference between the 2 decks in a lot of ways.
Up next, to my surprise, 51 copies is Simic Kinnan.
That's a huge rise. I mean, like there was like just a small handful of this Paradox Engine. Is that the card?
That is the card.
So there's just a handful at the championship. People, I think, started talking about it, are already iterating on it, and a much larger percentage of the field is this Simic Kinnan combo deck.
Should we talk about it really quick?
Yeah, it's time.
I mean, so we had a quick discussion of this in the Cool Decks Inc. section a couple weeks ago, and it's just generally that Paradox Engine untaps your non-land mana sources when you cast a spell.
It untaps all, well, of course, it'd be hard for them to write a card that said non-land mana sources, so it untaps all non-land permanents when you cast a spell.
And so like you can basically then get your like Kinnons and Mana Elves and Chromatic, your Mox Ambers and whatnot all on tap, right?
Right. Mind Stone.
Yeah, it's Mind Stone. It's all kinds of different kinds of ways to generate mana without being a land. And so what you try to do is get Paradox Engine out, you want Emery out, you want Kinnon out, and then you can use Emery over and over again to cast some kind of payoff from your graveyard. So you can cast Chromatic Sphere. You know, I played in one match where they cast Aether Spell Bomb over and over and over again to just pick up all my permanents and then went on their merry way. So there's a bunch of different things that you can do, but the key is that Emery also untaps when you cast a spell when Paradox Engine is out, and then you can cast a sacrificable artifacts card from your graveyard, and you just loop it like that. Mm-hmm. It's similar to what you used to try to do with Mishra's Bauble with Emery sometimes, but different cards, similar idea.
Yeah, powerful strategy. I'm sure it'll continue to be iterated upon.
Have you guys played against this deck very much?
Yeah, I've played against it a lot. I've seen versions that play like Power Stone Shard. I think that's the card from Dominaria where it taps for colorless equal to how many copies of Power Stone Shard you have. And then it plays Aetherflux Reservoir. So you're essentially just going off to an Aetherflux win. Some of these newer Simic Kinnon versions, I think, are cutting the Reservoir to do more Karn stuff.
Yeah, I've definitely seen Karn as a hallmark of the deck and something that you have to watch out for, because the thing that I forgot is that they would put a Paradox Engine in their sideboard to fetch with Karn, and so I kind of felt like I was in the clear one game and then was not.
I got one last POV here, which are the decks that went 5-1 or better. And in some cases, they reflect the overall metagame spread, because Uro Midrange is, again, the most represented deck. In this bucket, 28 copies went 5-1 or better, 33.7% of this winner's bracket. Mm-hmm. Same with Goblins, 14.5%, 12 copies. So it only went down like 0.1%.
Nice clean conversion, 33 to like 33.7.
Interesting. Sacrifice went up. It looks like to me that Sacrifice went from what we said 9% here to having 13 decks that went 5-1 or better if you count Jund and Rakdos together, for a grand total of 16.6%.
Yeah, I think the biggest takeaway for me here was actually the presence, or emergence rather, of the 9 Lives combo deck. 4 copies went 5-1 or better for just under 5%, which is basically the same as Jundsack, Azorius Aggro, and just under Azorius Control.
I have not played against that deck at all, have you?
Oh, yes. And it is annoying.
Oh, jeez. It works with Solemnity, right?
Correct, yeah. So 9 Lives basically prevents all damage dealt to you. Every time a source would deal damage to you, you put a counter on it. And when it gets 9 counters, you remove it and you lose the game. Solemnity is an enchantment that says permanents you control can't get counters. So you essentially lock your opponent out from killing you. It's one way to win.
Wow. Does it feel legit when you play against it? Like, does it feel like it has a real game to be able to get to its combo pieces, or is it just trying to draw A+B combo cards and kind of like buy time other than that?
Yeah, I think it's mostly buying time, and it has some points where it's super vulnerable, because if you even bounce the 9 Lives, they lose. Because 9 Lives, you die if it leaves the battlefield. And I gotta say, there was one time I totally whiffed where I had Into the Royal in my hand and they had 9 Lives out, and I just didn't read the card. And afterwards I was like, oh, I could have won in the most stylish way possible. But yeah, what's interesting to me ultimately is that we see 2 combo-ish decks kind of emerge a little bit in prominence over the course of the weekend in this one tournament series, be it 9 Lives and these Simic Kinnon decks. I think these might be a hint to what's to come. Maybe if people keep shaving Thoughtseizes just because they're playing Sacrifice or they're playing these aggro decks. And I kind of think Simic Uro is like the only Thoughtseize deck in Historic right now, or the main Thoughtseize deck in Historic at least.
Yeah, well, actually, I mean, Rakdos is running Thoughtseize too. It's just in the board.
Rakdos Sacrifice?
Yeah. You don't, I mean, amazingly, there's not room to play. You don't need Thoughtseize in the main deck in Rakdos, it seems like. But worth noting that 9 Lives has hexproof, by the way.
Oh, so I didn't whiff.
Yeah, you didn't whiff anyway.
Oh, thank you, Dave. Thank the Godfather.
Hat tip to some friendly Twitch chats from the Mickeys.
So I got to say, when we look at this 5-1 or better metagame, it doesn't look terrible to me. We have several aggro strategies, several control strategies, multiple combo decks, no shortage of mid-range. And there's like some really fun, spicy 1 or 2 ofs. Rakdos Luris, Bant Spirits was among the high-performing decks.
How?
They have Coco and a bunch of good spirits.
That's awesome. I really, really want to play that deck. All right. Shane, what do you think about this metagame?
I don't like that there's no Gruul, but I do like the fact that, the mono red aggro decks are showing up and they're doing fairly decently. Like we went from even outperformed kind of like the field to go 5-1 or better with like a doubled up that percentage almost. But yeah, I mean, I have a lot to say about kind of the Uro quote unquote mid-range style of decks this episode. That's kind of like my major piece is talking about how this deck works and what cards go into it and stuff like that. And also just kind of my thoughts on the performance of the deck against the meta as well. So it's like, you'll hear that later. But I think that one of the things I have been hearing on the podcast, I've been focusing on Historic lately, which I love. I love, this new kind of attention being paid to the non-rotating format on Arena. And some people have been saying that, the championship might have brought something new, right? Like, hey, the championship didn't bring any new decks. This idea that there may be undiscovered things in Historic is probably a pipe dream. Adhere to the good decks or, don't play on the ladder type thing. I mean, that's much more harsh than people were actually saying, right? But I think, we immediately are seeing the success of this Simic engine deck with Kinnan and whatnot. I think people are already iterating on that. I think the fact that Azorius Control is back in the meta is probably a good thing. It's a good thing to have a legitimate control deck. The 9 Lives combo is doing well. I think that Historic still is in flux, and WotC is going to keep it in flux in the near future as we get more anthologies, as we get more remastered sets, as we get more normal sets. I think that's one thing I think is exciting about Historic right now, is that it's actually a more aggressive pace of change than any other format we can have, because we're going backwards and forwards at the same time.
Whoa, it's like we're moving without moving, man.
I just watched Tenet. It's quite a bit like that.
We're going to change. I'm going to send a note to try to get them to change the format name from Historic to Tenet.
Yeah. Let's do it.
Perfect.
Do I have time for a brief installment of Cool Deck Sync?
I think we do. Let's do it.
Whoa, man, aggro.
Yeah. Well, for us to fit the content in, we have to be decisive, Shane. So let's do this.
Let's do these first 2, Stan.
All right. Is It Aggro, piloted by Mariano Mercado, finished 3-3 in Satellite 3. It kind of looks like Is It Prowess from Modern. You have 16 creatures. 8 of them are 1-mana wizards, 4 Sprite Dragon, and 4 Stormwing Entity, 2 Royal Scions, and then 23 instants and sorceries.
My only take here, there is no way to play your Stormwing Entity on turn 2 in the main deck. You could play a Tormod's Crypt and play a Stormwing Entity from there if you wanted to. No, it's not an instant or sorcery, so you can't do that. And there's also no way to protect your Stormwing Entity for free. So it does make me feel like there's a good chance that Stormwing Entity is quite a bit like less powerful in this kind of build. Of course, it's not Modern, but it takes away a lot of the attraction for the card for me. So on the one hand, I'm kind of hopeful that a deck like this could be good, but I'm a little skeptical of it. Now, on the other hand, there's no Lightning Bolt in this format, but there's a lot of Fatal Push. There's a lot of Eliminate, actually, and this card is really good against both of those.
Yeah.
And then there's some Heartless Act, which this card would not be good against. So, maybe there's some space for this card to be resilient to the types of removal that people just play in the format. What did you think, Stan?
I love spells. I love Is It spells. I don't think Royal Scions is actually that great in Historic, to be honest. I think it's a little slow for not enough payoff, just because so many of these creatures are easy to kill. And Royal Scions, even though in Modern sometimes that ultimate can be a win condition, because in Modern you can play bolts, and here Is It doesn't have access to that good of a burn spell. I don't think this is a deck that I'm looking for. But if it starts to do consistently better, you bet your butt I'm going to play it. I think I have all these cards, including the Stormwings.
Yeah, I would really like an excuse to buy Stormwings. Maybe I will. Hopefully I will.
Next deck, Sultai Explorer, piloted by Marcos Acosta, finished 4-2 in Satellite 8. 3 Uro, 4 Krasis, 4 Nissa. You think this is Sultai midrange, but wait, what's this? 4 Jade Light Ranger, 4 Wild Growth Walker, and 4 Merfolk Branch Walker. So basically cutting back on things like Extinction Event and Growth Spiral for some targeted removal. Even has a single copy of Command the Dreadhorde, which is a very funny way to close a game after you've been exploring every turn and gaining life off your Wild Growth Walkers.
I don't like this deck.
Why?
It looks like a mess. I just don't see what this is doing. Like, I just don't see what this is doing. Like,
here's what I'll say. I one quick response, because although I don't think I've played against this exact list, I have occasionally been paired up against Explore decks, like the old standard versions with better mana. And Wild Growth Walker is a pain in the tuchus.
I mean, it also just eats a Fatal Push. You know what I mean? Like,
but who's playing Fatal Push?
35% of the meta.
And who else? And no one else.
Not a single person.
Well, I mean, it's worth noting that Wild Growth Walker is not good against the decks that play Fatal Push. You know what I mean? So like they don't even care. So I don't think that if this goes up against regular Sultai, they're gonna bother to kill the Wild Growth Walker until it gets giant. This card has been problematic for me when I've played like aggro-y kind of decks for sure.
Oh yeah, like this thing is like you must have like a lightning strike or wizard's lightning or some kind of like targeted removal, or else you will lose, or some kind of bounce spell if you're super lucky. But I mean, there's just a lot of, I mean, this deck went 4-2, right? I mean, that's pretty sweet, but there's a lot of decisions here. Like this is clearly a slightly kind of like a ramp deck, but doesn't have any growth spiral, and like it's like leaning on Tamio, which I think is like really interesting. Like, okay, you're filling your graveyard, but what else are you really doing? I guess that's like the plus is okay, the minus is okay, but is that worth 2 cards? Like Vraska Golgari Queen is fine here. Like you don't really have a lot of stray permanents to sack off the plus, which I find interesting. Like, is it just really leaning on like controlling until you command the Dreadhorde type thing? There's just a lot going on here that I don't know how it fits together into a cohesive deck.
I'm not disagreeing. I will say that it's random iterations like this that kind of help challenge this notion that if you want to engage with the ladder, you only have to stick to tier 1. And the fact that someone can show up to an open and go 4-2, literally qualify for like the Sunday tournament with this explore pile with good Sultai cards. At least there's some evidence there that like good standard decks that exist on Arena from yesteryear might still be able to hold up with some minor, more contemporary upgrades. And I like that. If true, I like that.
Yeah. I mean, I think I agree with you, Stan, in that capacity, which is like, it's good that people are still doing new things and winning with it. And I think that's a feature of Historic because, the card pool is not that big. So you still have a lot of room for, there's a lot of good cards in the format, and people have been kind of focusing on the decks that people know. But there's a lot of opportunity out there for tweaking and tinkering.
All right, so that's Cool Decks Inc. We're not out of the breakdown just yet. I'm getting reports that Dave's on the ground from a separate tournament.
There was another tournament?
Dave, are you there?
I'm here.
Was there another tournament?
There was this weekend. And so I think it's worth talking for a minute about the other tournament that has happened this weekend, which is the first Arena Open for Historic. I believe it was the first one for Historic.
That is not true.
It's not true?
No.
That's a lie.
All right. Well, the first one to me.
Yeah. New to you.
Let's say that. So there was a Historic Arena Open this weekend, and it was announced a little way back. For those who aren't familiar, the Opens are a kind of different take on a high-level tournament that kind of only Arena can do. So the thing about the MTG Melee tournaments that people do is that they run them mostly as like conventional tournaments. You know, they do like round matching and things like that. You go to Melee to see who your matchup's supposed to be. You go back and check in with them. It's all like kosher with Arena, but it is like a normal tournament. It's synchronous. You play at the same time. The Opens are set up specifically to be kind of a similar matchmaking experience to what the rest of Arena is like. And so it's a high-ish stakes tournament on Arena that uses the asynchronous kind of matching that Arena does to let you spend one day qualifying for a day two and then play day two playing for real cash. And so, you know, if you haven't done this before, just so you know, when you do day one of the Open, first off, it's $20 to get into the tournament. Basically, it's 4,000 gems.
Ooh,
it's a lot less. It's a lot more expensive than the SCGs,
which is $20 basically.
Yeah, it's around $20
at the cheapest. At the cheapest you can spend is $20.
Yes, but in day one of the Open, you get to choose if you want to play best of one and try to go 7-2 or better to qualify, or you can play best of 3 and go 4-0 and qualify for day two. Now, if you play in the best of 3 event on day one, you get better prizes. If you play in the best of 2 event, you get worse prizes. But either way, you still get a qualifier for the same pool on day 2, and that's all best of 3. So if you win, get a 4-0 in best of 3, you get 5,000 gems back and a shot at day 2. If you get a win in best of 1, you get 2K in gems back and a shot at day 2. So you actually like lose gems if you qualify for day 2 on the best of 1 bracket.
Classic.
But it's easier to do it.
Right, because losses are more forgiving, basically.
Yeah. And in another twist, you can try to qualify as many times as you want to with this. So it's basically like a poker tournament with rebuy.
Oh, yeah.
And so you can just pop in, you can take a shot at it, you can change decks after that if you don't make it, and try again and try again. The thing that's interesting about these, or the thing that I think is most publicized about these, is that you play for real cash on day 2, even in a asynchronous way. So if you go 6-2 on day 2, you get you want to go 6-2 or better. Basically, you get to play until you have 2 losses in day 2. If you go 6-2, you get $1,000 in cash. If you go 7-1, you get $2,000 in cash.
Ooh, United States dollars?
Yeah, and I mean,
is that tax free?
Obvious.
Not in gems, right? In real money.
I'm sure it is not tax free, and it's not in gems. You're right. It's just in real money. I think it's pretty interesting. You know, I wanted to try a higher level tournament last week. I didn't have time, or it's really hard for me to do the synchronous tournament at this point. So something like the Open is perfect for me to pop in, play some matches, leave, come back, all that kind of stuff. Works great for my schedule. And so I wanted to give it a try. And so I was working on a deck all last week for the tournament. Like I said, I was working on Rack Sack, and I just didn't really feel like I was ready to run it out in a big tournament yet. So I just, on Saturday night, after we got the kids down, having a cocktail with the wife, I was like, you know what? I'm just going to fire up and try to qualify for day 1 or for day 2 with blue-white auras. And so I lost my first match, and I was like, maybe I made a mistake, but then I kind of got it together and ended up going 7-2 to qualify for day 2 with a little bit of a twist on a best of 1 auras deck that I had kind of tweaked some of the conclusions I had about the deck from the last time we played with a listener, and who gave me a bunch of good tips. His name was Drew D. I want to say thank you for giving me some tips on Twitter about the last time I talked about auras. Now, I didn't take all of Drew's advice, but I took a lot of it under consideration. And then I also took some tips from longtime friends of the show, Jay Seeds, who is someone that Shane and I grew up with, that I used to play Magic with, and he actually went Mythic with blue-white auras on Saturday.
What?
And
I did not know this.
Yeah, and so he and I were texting on Saturday before I hopped into the queue for the Open, so I was getting some of his thoughts on the way that his build was working before I went in with that. So we'll throw a couple of lists into I don't want to take too much longer on this, but basically I beat goblins 3 times. 3 times I beat goblins in qualifying. It actually felt like a pretty good matchup at this point. I beat mono white life game. I beat a red green landfall Cavalier of Thorns deck. I beat a mono red aggro deck, and I beat a blue green paradox deck. Little bit of a blur. That last one I know was an Uro deck, and I think was paradox. I ended up losing to a Grixis control deck and a colorless ramp deck, which I think is another deck we should start keeping an eye on eventually here. But, you know, it was really good. I mean, I played, you know, Auras is a deck that can snowball really fast. If people don't have all their interaction in, you can get going really fast. In particular, it seemed like Goblins decks weren't running Goblin Gemraiser in the main, and that's really difficult because they can just kill your threat quite often with that card. You know, I had to do normal kind of Aura stuff. I had to work out blocks, when to commit, when not to. I luckily didn't face any Racksack decks because Racksack versus Auras is heavily, heavily favored for Racksack in my mind. But a couple of other things that really saved me, you know, I ended up switching from Cartouche of Knowledge back to Staggering Insights, which I think is really, really good at the 2-drop. And then putting Arcane Flight back in at the 1-drop slot to give stuff flying, and cutting down on things like Karametra's Blessing and Sentinel's Eyes. I didn't have any Heliod's Punishments anymore. I really was just kind of like all in on trying to make my threats as efficient as possible. Thought that was really interesting. I ran one spicy Shadow Spear in the main as a reusable kind of evasion to get the trample off of it or life gain if I needed it. That was from JC's gave me that idea. But it's pretty costly, so I'm not sure whether I would do it again, but it definitely worked a couple of times, so it's something that I would keep on the map for sure. So anyway, I went 7-2. I queued for day 2.
Yeah.
Yeah, which was like, okay, now that I did that, I was like, how am I going to play this tournament? Because I have small children all day. And
more importantly, I want to hear, how do they deliver the funds? Is it direct deposit?
Well, unfortunately, I didn't win any funds in day 2, so I only went 2-2. But one thing to keep in mind if you play one of these is that you are constrained on the time that you can be around for day 2. So you can sign up as early as 6 a.m. Pacific time to start playing matches, but it ends at 5 p.m. Pacific time. So it's 11 hours that it's open for you to get in your matches that you need to do to play. And so for me, that's in all time that my children are awake. And so I had to figure out, like, how can I sneak in some matches? And so I just kind of did it while I was watching them. At one point, I beat, like, blue-white control when my kids were fighting in the background and stuff. And then, like, they actually took a nap. And then I had to, like, I actually won matches when they were awake and lost matches when they were sleeping, which seems like really counterintuitive. But it was all good. It was a lot of fun. I managed to make 2,000 gems out of the whole thing at going 2-2. And then that was kind of it. It was fun. I was glad that I did it. I definitely would play these again, even though they are pricey. I don't think I'm the person who's going to queue multiple times into day 1, but I think for trying to, like, have the experience of a Grand Prix from your home, it's not bad.
Yeah, I think the fact that you can pay for these events with gems or gold is a really good incentive to hoard gold.
Yeah.
And
What's the gold cost?
like 20K or something.
20,000. It's a lot of gold.
Yeah, it's still ostensibly free to play, which is pretty cool.
Exactly. Yeah. And, you know, I have a bad habit of sometimes getting daily deal cosmetics or sleeves when it's like, hey, I play Lightning Strike. I should get this full art.
I deserve it.
Yeah. And maybe that's a mistake.
Now, I do have something that I have to talk about really quickly that was unpleasant with this, which is, I don't know if people were watching on Twitter, but there were a bunch of people tweeting screen grabs of an error happening to them in the tournament where either their deck disappeared or their hand size was set to 0 after they came off of sideboarding. So I actually lost a match in day 2 where I lost game 2 narrowly, lost game 1 narrowly, came back after sideboarding for game 2, and there was nothing happening on the battlefield. I didn't have a deck. My opponent didn't have a deck. There wasn't anything going on. So I logged out of the client, and when I came back in, they had skipped my turn twice and had me keep a 1-lander. I actually won this game somehow.
My man.
Where my opponent took 2 extra turns and I kept a 1-lander. But game 3, when I started game 3, that's when I got the error that people were really tweeting about. That was like, why is my opponent's life at 0 and I have no library and it's making me discard my hand after my first turn? My opponent's at -4 and nothing's happening. So I had to I actually logged out, logged back in, and it skipped 2 turns for me as a result of that. And then I had a normal game, which I barely lost somehow. But I actually had a pretty good experience filing a ticket for them. So I got pretty tilted when I was like describing this experience to people in the Slack channel. And I was like, what are they going to do? And so I stopped for a minute and I filed a ticket and they removed the loss from me within like 10 or 15 minutes. They set my record back to no losses.
Interesting.
So while that was super bad, the customer service was pretty good. So just keep that in mind when you're playing. Like when stuff goes bad, the TOs will help you out.
Sweet.
Hey,
So-
congrats on day 2.
Thanks.
Now 2 of my co-hosts have done that, and I still have not.
I already had a day 2, a paper day 2 previously.
A goal to set for Stanislav for 2021. Should we take a quick break and then return with some Dive Down content?
Let's do it.
I think that's a good idea. Stay with us. And we're back. So I gotta say, the Dive Down co-hosts, we've kind of been falling in love with Magic Arena. And I think, agree or disagree, but in some, if not all cases, the shortcomings of the formats or the economy on Magic Arena is made up for the fact that it's such an easy and fun and engaging client to play Magic on.
Definitely. It's super easy. It's just it's so much faster. My like time to play a match is, super efficient. When I'm in a pinch, I'm just like, I should bust out some dailies. I'm just like, let's play some best of one Red Wizards and have some fun. It's like, you can do a lot of different stuff with it.
Yeah, it's super helpful to me, like I was talking about with the previous conversation about the tournament that I day 2 that Stan's never done. And it's all about the asynchronous thing for me that makes it really helpful. Like even in tournaments like that, they figured out a way to make it possible for me to check in and check out, which is nice. I mean, I love Magic Online and Modern, but it's nice to not have to sit down and have to play a 4-round prelim to be able to have like high level competition.
And as a result, we've been playing a lot of Arena just out of our sheer curiosity and interest, and in some cases picking up new decks to get better at this metagame, explore the format, and hopefully be better content creators. But at the same time, we had this week not a ton of news, no great deck dive targets to discuss. So we figured, why don't we just show up and talk about the decks we've been playing for our own sheer enjoyment?
Yeah, and also because we're testing some of the more popular decks, some of the more powerful decks, and we wanted to be able to do not exactly a sleeve, believe, heave, because these are all decks that are proven and legitimate, but more kind of like, here's how these decks play, kind of like a mini deck dive across 3+ different decks for you to learn from, for us to explain like kind of how they feel in the format and how sort of historic power level cards may differ in both the cards themselves and the deck construction expectations versus something like Modern.
So I gotta make a confession here. That whole time that Dave was giving his tournament report where he customer serviced his way into day 2, I was just sitting here thinking, when is Shane going to talk about Sultai midrange? Like, this is why I showed up on Monday.
I think I'll talk about it right now, Stanislav. Midrange is one of my old nemesises. Like, I just can't avoid the Siren's Call of this deck, and it's probably because I play like so many aggressive decks and then they beat me, and then I'm like, these decks just always have to win. I gotta play this deck, and this is like always like a terrible idea. It's always a fool's errand to try to play the deck that you think just wins all the time, and you're sadly disappointed.
Stan, do you remember a couple weeks ago when I was talking about a new button that Shane might be making pretty soon? I'm starting to get some buttony vibes here.
Midrange lives. Quote, Shane beeps.
I'm sensing more mid-range died in my hands, quote, Shane beeps. But let's see where this goes.
Honestly, I mean, a little bit of a tease. I don't think this deck's mid-range, but we'll talk about why that is.
Okay.
I've built and played mid-range in a lot of formats, like Abzan and Con Standard, Abzan and Jund in Modern. Even like you could ostensibly call like the Collected Company Value Town sort of creature decks mid-range until they really became outclassed in Modern. And until recently, you really wouldn't think about the color blue being part of like the powerhouse mid-range deck. And that's, I think, mostly because blue was operating on a different axis that didn't like mesh well with what mid-range decks really are, or at least were, like trying to do, which is disrupt the board, present efficient threats, disrupt the hand, remove those threats from the board that actually get through, and then just generate more value per card than the opponent is really able to do, and then win that long game. And that's been the domain of colors like black for efficient removal, green for the efficient beaters, and then frequently red for kind of both, I guess. Like, maybe some Gruul cards, maybe some removal. Mm-hmm. And there's a recent printing of a couple cards that began that shift from mid-range, into blue. And first was Oko, which was this outrageously efficient and powerful like threat eradicator and creator. And of course, that got quickly banned out of the formats that we talk about. And then Uro, Titan of Nature's Wrath, which is a card that does a number of things that pretty much any mid-range or controlling deck wants to be doing. Gaining life, drawing cards, ramping your mana, giving you a huge stabilizing creature on the battlefield, and then providing that ongoing advantage every turn that it sticks on the battlefield. And so as long as Uro is legal in a format, any player that wants to like turn that proverbial corner, take over the long game, is going to want to run that card.
Minor nitpick, but don't you think Uro demands a certain type of deck construction? Like any blue-green deck can't just throw in an Uro, because there's going to be a lot of strategies where it's 3 mana, draw a card, gain a life, or gain 3 life.
I mean, that's kind of outside the scope of this conversation, Stan, but I think that what kind of Simic deck are you creating besides, I think I played against like Simic Spirits recently, but maybe they want to run it too. I don't know.
How about, let's put a pin in this interjection, and then I will revisit it during my mini dive.
Yeah, let's do it.
Perfect.
Okay, so sorry for the little history lesson. Brings us to Historic, where of course Uro is legal, which means it is, if not the most powerful creature in the format, and usually want to play those in your deck, right? And that makes Sultai Midrange the go-to midrange deck of Historic. But like I said, I kind of want to talk about the name of this deck before I talk about the deck itself, Sultai Midrange. And I really don't think this is a midrange deck, because I think this is fundamentally a ramp control deck, which is an interesting sort of archetype to find itself atop the Historic metagame, or very close to it. Because like let's look at modern, right? Like Uro piles look more like stricter control decks. They have the cheap removal in white, and they have cheap counter spells, they have the really powerful creatures like Uro and Omnath that give you that ongoing value. Then of course they have the Planeswalkers, and Azorius colors primarily lets them take over the long game as well. This Historic deck doesn't look a lot like many other decks, or at least many other successful decks, I guess, that we've seen before. And I'm sure I'm forgetting something, so feel free to call me out. But that's, I think, primarily because Uro incentivizes a heavy Simic mana base due to the blue, green escape cost. And so you can't splash an Uro like you could potentially splash an Oko back in the day, right? And so... And as this, the blue, green escape cost has, like it's done in Modern and Pioneer, pushes that deck out of the realm of Golgari, out of the realm of Jund, and well into Simic, right? And another feature of Historic is that the only really efficient removal is in black. You don't have Bolt, you don't have Path. And then Thoughtseize for some reasons in the format, and so it's even more appealing to move into the black color as well. And then we get stuff like the Zagoth Triome printed in iLob. You have all the shocks, you have all the checks, you have Fabled Passage. You're able to do exactly what WotC claimed that we wouldn't be able to do when they kept the fetches even out of Pioneer, and of course out of Historic, which is run good stuff piles that have nearly no problem with their mana.
Yeah, but the whole reason that these good stuff piles have no problem with their mana is because of the rampart you were talking about, right?
Yeah,
because you get to play and draw extra lands, and so you're fixed all the time. And even if a deck like this runs, if they run Fable Passage, you're not as reliant on it for fixing as you are sometimes for like filling a little hole in your perfect mana base.
Exactly. Yeah, like you're filling the color you might need. You're enabling Revolt. You're filling the graveyard for Uro's Escape. All that little kind of stuff. So like you kind of have every incentive to run the best cards black, green, and blue have to offer in Pioneer, and you can do so pretty easily because of the mana and the ramp cards that Dave mentioned, and this deck is the result. And so yeah, there's a lot of context. Sorry for all the context here, which is kind of fine because I feel like the actual construction of this deck is somewhat straightforward. Like playing it pretty much isn't super straightforward, but we're going to get to that later. So we kind of, I saw you guys narrow your eyes or raise your eyebrows when I said it's a ramp control deck, right? Not a real mid-range deck. And I think the main reason I call it that is because the first thing you notice is a major lack of early and efficient creature threats. Like the only creatures in this deck are like 2 to 3 Hydroid Krasis and 3 to 4 Uros. And neither of these are plays that you can get onto the board very early, or you want to get onto the board very early. And even if you did, they're not stabilizing you. Like Uro, of course, is.
Yeah, I mean, this deck generally does have no problem with playing a turn 3 Uro, right? Like just doing it, unless you're keeping up counters for some reason.
Depending on what you're doing, like depending on the threats on the other side of the battlefield. But yeah, like you will frequently just get the Uro going, and you get that ramp going and stuff like that. But
right.
You're not getting them onto the battlefield to as your Goyf. You're not starting to attack or block with them anytime pretty early. Like when you're able to escape that Uro and untap with it, then you're capitalizing on that crazy text box. And when you cast that late game Krasis for like X equals 10, and you're gaining 5 life and drawing 5 cards and getting your 10/10 flyer, you're not going to lose that game. But what the deck does, where the deck resembles more mid-range decks that you've seen is like the hand disruption and removal suite. Like you've got Fatal Push, you've got Thoughtseize, and Fatal Push gets that little funny bump in power level because of like the Uro sacrifice enables Revolt. And
right.
Fabled Passage also does it, and like I said, there's that black removal that only black really gets, like Bloodchief's Thirst and Eliminate and Heartless Act and Maelstrom Pulse and all that kind of stuff that you want in various amounts and numbers depending on your, the meta that you're facing or the style of deck you want to play. And this deck really leans hard on the ILOB sweeper of Extinction Event, which is a 3 and a black sorcery and lets you exile each creature that's either even or odd CMC. And 0 CMC counts for things like tokens and lands. And Modern Jund doesn't even play Damnation really right now.
Yeah.
But these Sultai decks are running like 2 or 3 Extinction Events because it helps clean up the board early. Like on turn 4, you're like, okay, I need to sweep out, like you get a 3 for 1 here. And then late, you can clean up the board without necessarily getting rid of all of your own threats.
Yeah, and I think you actually have to be a little careful when you're playing against this deck to keep in mind that they can play Extinction Event on turn 3. If they want to. You go Growth Spiral, play Extinction Event. Definitely got me when I was playing them with auras. So
yeah, it's really nice. It exiles as well, which is an important bit of text on Extinction Event because it gets rid of Uro entirely. It's out of the graveyard. There's plenty of recursive threats that Raxac might want to get back. So because of that strong blue identity I mentioned earlier, there's a number of main deck blue cards here as well. Aethergust, main deck Aethergust, okay? It's saying something about this format, like Historic, that even like running 2 or even more main deck Aethergust is fully defensible and probably the right thing to be doing. And I mean, clearly the right thing to be doing based on the win rates at least. I mean, it's a really challenging card. This is getting into the play a little bit early, but I wanted to pick your guys' brains on Aethergust. I think it's a really challenging card to play well because there's a lot of timing things that you have to think about. Like you can bounce a green or a red spell on the stack. You can wait for it to become a permanent and bounce it from the board at instant speed. Is it the better tempo play to like bounce the spell when they cast it? Or do you like do it on their next first main phase to like mess up their attack plan? Like what's the spell that you want to gust? Like, does it make sense to even put it back on the top of their deck? Is it buying you enough real tempo to bother playing then? It's sneaky in that the more you play with it, the more you do appreciate it for its flexibility. But then you also do hate that it's never a true counterspell in a lot of ways.
Yeah. I mean, I've had a lot more success with that card just because I don't play mid-rangey decks too much as as a remand, basically, in an aggro deck in some ways that has the get out of jail card, free card where you can lift a permanent instead of a spell. And so being able to like Aethergust someone's like Clothis or something like that is helpful in addition to being able to quote unquote counter their spell. Or against Prowess where, somebody attacks with a giant Soulscar Mage and you're like, no, pick it up. And then there's no good options with that card really. But I do think it's a bit more difficult in a deck like this to figure out exactly how to use it, like you said, because this deck wants removal so much more than it wants tempo. But the thing that this deck is doing is buying time so that it can ramp and play Nissa, basically. So, if that's the plan, it's like I need to buy myself a turn so that I can make sure I get to Nissa, and that'll make me win the game. Then that makes sense as far as having Aether Gust as well.
Yeah. Tail's End is becoming a more commonly seen singleton main deck inclusion right now. Like our buddy Aspiring Spike, of course, is famous for championing this card recently. Others are beginning to take notice, I think. Tail's End, 1 in the blue, counter target activated ability, triggered ability, or legendary spell. And this is surprisingly valuable kind of all over the place. Like stifle your or an opponent's like Uro trigger or Uro itself, or you counter that Embercleave or like the Muxus, or you counter any Planeswalker, or you counter Ulamog or the Ulamog trigger. Counter, there's just so many little random things like Priest of the Forgotten Gods, like Dave's going to talk about. Spoilers. And I think Tail's End is pretty rad. It's like a fun one of. It's fun to have some more on the side. I think it's definitely flexible enough in this meta to handle the threats you're going to see. And the other spell Dave mentioned earlier that makes it more like a ramp deck, which is my fundamental claim here, is Growth Spiral. Like, so this is an instant speed cantrip that also ramps your mana. Of course, that's a 4 of in this deck.
So good.
It allows, this along with Uro allows for some pretty speedy ramping into your mid and late game threats, and just pulls you ahead of the opponent in terms of what you're able to do on the board than they're doing. And like Dave said, that threat, that I think the most significant threat perhaps that I saved for last is Nissa Who Shakes the World. And you could conceivably call this a Nissa deck, I think, because along with Uro, Nissa is what lets you turn that corner, and you can turn it hard, really hard. Like the plus creates threats, and you can attack with them without giving up the board. Like you don't open Nissa up for a crackback frequently, but just by attacking with them.
Because they have vigilance.
Why do they have vigilance? Yes. Why do they have vigilance? It's so
let you do
absurd.
Crazy stuff with your mana. Attack with them, then use them to cast twice as many spells as you might normally. Her static ability, of course, ramps your mana, lets any forest tap for additional mana, which is crazy. Like it's fun, the things you realize when you play it too. Like a breeding pool is a forest, but you don't have to tap the breeding pool for green. You tap the breeding pool for blue, and you make an additional green. So like you can, it's one of the things about playing Arena even on my laptop screen is like seeing what mana I have in play is actually pretty challenging. So like I'm constantly mousing over everything and being like, well, what do I animate here? Like what makes the most sense? What lets me create the most mana without putting like a valuable land at risk to like a removal spell? And so it's a lot. There's a lot there. But once you have Nissa online, then you cast a huge Hydroid Krasis, or you cycle away like your unnecessary Triomes, or like cycling lands without really losing tempo because you have so much mana available to you. And sticking in early Nissa, I would say, is like one of, if perhaps the fundamental goal of the deck. And being like the first player to do so in the mirror is like you've won the game. It just pulls you ahead so significantly and allows you to just get that single extra creature of value on the board. Of course, like Extinction Event in the mirror can do some work there, but like you get that turn 4 Nissa on the play and you're feeling really good about it, like when your opponent didn't have any Growth Spirals or something like that. The mana base is kind of what you expect, like 8 Shocks, 4 Triomes, some basics, some Fabled Passage. I like the Singleton Castle Lochthwain that Sultai can run over 4 color. It's really good for some kind of ongoing card draw, and it's a good reason, I think, to play Sultai over 4 color. Sideboard, because you're in 3 good colors, you have so many options, so much flexibility. Like you can have more sweepers, like Cry of the Carnarium or Witch's Vengeance for like your goblins or sacrifice decks. You can have Narset or Shark Typhoon for the mirror, or like control decks, or Negate or Aether Gust where you need it, or like some Elder Gargaroth or some random Planeswalker like Ashiok. And like the world's your oyster when you're playing 3 colors like this, and you can really tune it to fit the meta that you are seeing or expecting in a given tournament.
Yeah, I mean, a big one that I forgot about in this meta is Narset, Parter of Veils.
Yeah, she's a crusher.
So good. And like it shuts down decks that you don't necessarily think it would. Like it's a very difficult card for blue-white auras to have hit the board and have a little bit of and stick. Oh yeah. Because it draws some removal and then also keeps me from drawing cards for a turn. It basically, even if it keeps me from doing it for a turn, it's a big setback when you're on that blue-white deck. So
yeah. All right, moving on to kind of how this deck plays. And like when you play this deck is when you realize that's not really mid-range. Besides just the deck construction, like, or perhaps as mid-range as you might be used to. Like your early goal, of course, like any control deck, is to not be overwhelmed by aggro decks and also develop your game plan more quickly than your opponent is doing if you're in like a slower matchup. Like you want to try to prevent them from enabling their game plan while enabling yours so you can get the most value as early as possible. So like, you're doing the same things. You're stripping the opponent's hand with Thoughtseize. You're using your removal to stop meaningful threats, keep that life total high enough. You're ramping with Growth Spiral if that it's always so great on turn 2 when you're like, okay, I'm representing an Aether Gust, I'm representing a Fatal Push, I'm representing an Eliminate, and you don't do anything reasonable, I Growth Spiral. Sweet. Like I start ramping my mana, I'm drawing through my deck. Maybe early on you're playing an Uro, like Dave said, to get that mana online, keep drawing through your deck as well. You can, when you need to, you get like that quick 2 or 3 for 1 with like your first Extinction event. You sort of stabilize there a little bit. You keep making your mana, your land drops because you want to play on curve, or even better, like ahead of curve. And so it runs 28 lands typically. You know what I mean? Like, this is not mid-range territory typically. This is more control deck land count.
Quick question about some of these decks that are running like 28 or more lands. Are you keeping 5 land hands sometimes? What are your mulligan decisions like?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I've been punished on stream for dumb keeps. And
like by Twitch, you got like DMCA'd?
Oh, no. I'm punished by losing, where it's like, okay, I've got an Extinction event and a Maelstrom Pulse and a Nissa and 4 lands, right? And it's like, okay, all I have to do is, yeah, that's right. Yeah,
that's not a good keep.
No, it's a good. It looks like a good keep, right? And then like your opponent is Gruul, and they get, or like a weird, like some kind of creature deck that gets 4 creatures on the board before you can cast your first sweeper, and you only get 2 of their cards, and your land and your life total is like at 9 already, and you can't stabilize from there. And so in the blind, there are keeps that are good, and then when you know what you're playing, you have to sort of be like, you have to be realistic, right? Which is, okay, am I going to stabilize in time? Are they going to be able to put enough pressure on me when they're on the play and I'm not, type thing, to really make this work? But yes, Stan, I think that you can sort of rely on the deck to give you something that is perhaps enough. I think that if you don't have ramp, it's tempting to be like, okay, I've got 5 lands and I can play them, boom, 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 and I can have my Nissa, but like you need to be a little bit ahead of the curve than that. So like, whether that's an Uro getting you ahead of the curve or like a Growth Spiral, I think those Growth Spiral is like sneakily and really important to this deck. And it's one of the most important cards that you can see in your opener, just because it's so free, and it is more than free in that it lets you get ahead of what your opponent's doing, like mana for mana cost. And then, once you get that Nissa down, you have the mana for it. You make your land creatures, you make your mana insane, and then you cast your like huge Krasis, you escape that Uro really easily. I think Nissa is often enough to win with, because like I said, she defends herself so well with the creature land she's making. You're able to make these board states where like your second or like your third Extinction event gets cast on odd. You keep all your creature lands. Maybe your Hydroid Krasis is there, and like they have 1 or 2 creatures left, and you're like, well, I was already putting so much pressure, whittling your creatures down, and it's just, you're able to make that corner turn like the most powerful mid-range deck of all time, because you have the creature engine that also makes you able to cast your X spells or double spell so easily.
All right, Shane.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Thoughts?
You've given us your take.
Yeah. Well, that's more of like the treatise, the primer. I mean, the deck's clearly very good, right? Like if I was doing a sleeve believe heave, like I wouldn't have any choice but to say it's a sleeve.
You know what this sounds like to me?
What's that?
This is Tron.
Well, I mean, it's like Tron in a way,
In that it's
like
a tap-out control deck where instead of Expedition Map, you play Growth Spiral, and instead of Chromatic Sphere, you play like Mind Stone.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I said it's a ramp control deck, which is what Tron is.
Yeah, but you also don't have to tap out with this deck because your cards are instants, or at least lots of them are instants, which is helpful. Like your removal spells are instants, Growth Spiral is an instant, which is absurd.
Yeah.
But so it helps you not be a tap out, so you get to do other stuff too sometimes.
So it's better than Tron.
Well, it's not as one note as Tron, like, you know what I mean? And sometimes that's bad.
Yeah.
Like, so, and I'll get into kind of like where I feel like it's bad sometimes. Like the issue for me with this deck ends up being like, what is this deck doing for me in a given environment? And is that the best thing for me to be doing, whether that's caring about my win rate or caring about my enjoyment of the game? Because like, let's talk win rate, right? Like the deck is good, but statistically on the ladder, it's not overpowered. Like our friends at Untapped tell us that Sultai mid over the past month in Platinum to Mythic, where I think things get real, it has a 57% win rate. Like that sounds incredible until you see that 6 other decks have similar or even higher win rates up there. Like Sultai has a pretty middle of the road performance against a lot of the other top decks. Like one of the worst matchups is one of the most popular. It's Goblins. And Sultai wins that like 37% of the time.
How is that? That's unreal to me for some reason.
You can't stop. You don't have enough, like, you're really leaning on Extinction Event, and like you just have everything has to line up perfectly. Like you have to have the right Thoughtseize at the right. I mean, the Thoughtseize at the right time. You have to have the Aether Gust at the right time. You have to have the Sweeper that hits like all of their even or all of their odd creatures. Everything has haste, so it's like it's such a pain to have everything line up perfectly. Like I've beaten it, but 37% of the time I think feels pretty accurate.
Also, the sweepers don't get everything because like Goblin Snoop will survive a bunch of turns, and then you can just rebuild your board really quickly.
Right.
Yeah, that you can you can rebuild so quickly, like you said, Stan. Where it's like, yeah, I've stabilized, but no one cares because like you just untap and go crazy again, or have like that third Muxus or something like that, right? I think that Sultai makes up that sort of Goblin's weakness by handling things like mono red or auras quite well. And of course, it's going to like gobble up any random ladder jank that someone might be playing up there. So it's important to note, though, that Untapped is from actual people playing the ladder. Like this is not the very best players in a tournament environment, right? And that's going to skew the performance of various decks. Sultai involves more decisions than a lot of other decks. And the more decisions mean things are going to go wrong. There's lots of edges to be gained with the very best playing. And like we're the normal people on the ladder, right? And I think that I take a lot more stock in Untapped data than I do like tournament conversion rates or win rates there, simply because like, you know, we're the normies, you know what I mean? Like we're the casual spikes playing on the ladder. And so like if it's 57%, I'm not saying like this is some kind of thing that's outstanding in the field. And then the games are long. Like you have to think a lot. And without necessarily a return on that investment, unless you just like playing that kind of deck and you like thinking a lot and you like making a lot of decisions. And there's definitely a specific segment of the player population that is into that. And the problem for me, though, is that the gameplay feels pretty similar, like game after game. Like you have a lot of lines to get to that end game, but like your end game is what it is. And that's fine. Like I think a lot of control decks are like that, right? Which is like, I don't have a lot of win cons and I get to them and I take over with them. But you can kind of like, you can turn that potential bug of Sultai into a feature. Like when you get into that tournament meta, like you tune the deck for things you expect to see. You shore up those bad matchups without necessarily compromising like your overall performance, because you're not necessarily saying like, I have to account for everything. I can account for 4 things or 5 things. but on the ladder, like if I'm trying to make my way to Mythic, like I'm just going to go back to Gruul or go back to like a really good mono red deck or something like that. Or like maybe even try Auras, because like these are statistically similar to Sultai with like much shorter matches. Like I played like, 10 Sultai matches and like maybe 6 4-color matches. And I've played like 3 times as long as twice as many matches of Gruul. Like, you know what I mean? Like it's so much more efficient. But anyway, that's a ton of time spent. I apologize, but I think this is an important deck to talk about and get into.
Yeah, it's 45% of the meta, so you took 45% of the time that we had.
Yeah.
Directly proportional match length to episode length.
To dive down length. I mean, look, sleeve it. I'm just kidding. Next.
I will say the most interesting learning to me is that it doesn't run over goblins quite as much as I thought it did. And maybe part of that is user error. Maybe part of that is just like untapped data is looking at a large sample size. So it's not necessarily the end all be all translation of what your experience is going to be as a player. But I mean, 28 lands, that's a lot of air, and it's a slow deck. So like if you can combo off and like play Muxus on turn 3 or 4, it sounds like that'll just do it a lot.
It always feels like this deck just plays lands and then I lose. Like I just like I'm always like, I'm gonna get there, and then it's like, oh,
I didn't get there.
Yeah.
Or they play a single Elder Gargaroth and you're like, well,
Yeah,
I lose. I'm playing Gruul.
I'm gonna lose very slowly. All right, can I change the pace a little bit?
Oh, please.
I'm gonna try to sell you guys something that I've got in the trunk of my car.
What does Teferi say?
The time is now.
Let's slow things down. Is that what he says?
Yeah. We're gonna speed things up though, because Stan has what he thinks is one of the best decks in best of 1, as opposed to one of the best decks in best of 3, I guess, in Sultai. Yeah?
Can I interest you in a 2-card combo that can win on turn 3?
Whoa.
It never whiffs, and it works so quickly that you never have to worry about running out of time or clicking too much.
Sounds great.
That sounds pretty nice, right?
No.
All right, so
Dave hates it.
So I recently decided to bite the bullet and buy into a deck that has kind of been on my radar for a while now, and that is 4-color Neostorm.
Wow. Yeah.
Oh, you monster. I thought you changed the script on me. You have those fake notes, like you just peeled off and revealed Neoform, and I'm out of this episode now.
That's right. I'm not talking about Rakdos Arcanist. I'm talking about Neostorm. You monster. Neostorm sounds like a children's toy from the 90s, like a board game.
And it just sounds like a really important plot point from the Matrix to me. But
You get caught up in the Neostorm.
Tin, tin, tin.
Neostorm.
Neostorm. Should I do my whole section in this voice? The Neostorm voice.
My name is Neostorm.
Neostorm play kit only comes with the included accessories and vehicles, does not come with the playset.
All right.
Lighting and effects added.
That's what it is. Yeah. Okay. All right, let's do this.
Neostorm. Yeah, I don't think I'm going to talk as much as Shane because my deck is so much faster. Neostorm, it's a combo deck. It's based in blue-green. Those are Simic colors. But it is built to support 4 colors, and that includes red and black.
So this is a Simic deck that doesn't run Uro.
Basically, yeah. And I'll talk about Uro just a little bit because I did shoehorn a couple of them into the sideboard and then realized that they kind of have no place in it. And I'll get to why eventually. But the thing about Neostorm is that it is designed entirely to serve a single purpose, which is to cast Neoform and then just make essentially infinite copies of that spell, with the goal of flooding the board with a bunch of 3/3s, giving them haste, and then attacking once, sometimes twice in a single turn. And I'm going to explain how all this works in more detail because I do think that understanding how all the mechanics of the deck work together is basically the most important step, not just to figure out how this deck works and wins, but also how to beat it. And I'm going to do this in the most fun way possible, which is talking about lines, the shortest distance between 2 points. The most typical win that I found while piloting Neostorm and playing against it basically happens by casting 2 cards, and those are Seagate Stormcaller, followed immediately by Neoform. And even though everyone knows what Neoform does, I'm going to read it anyway, because I did not fully grasp how powerful this synergy is until I actually loaded the deck up myself. Neoform is blue and a green for sorcery. As an additional cost to cast this spell, sack a creature. Search your library for a creature with CMC equal to 1 plus the sacked creature's CMC. Put it on the battlefield with a 1/1 counter, shuffle. And I'll admit that this was not intuitive to me at first, but the reason this card and combo works is because that first line of text about sacrificing a creature only comes up the first time you cast the spell.
Oh.
Every subsequent copy just goes on the stack without being cast. You don't have to sack any more creatures. You just sack the first creature, Jerry.
Oof.
So in other words, this is not a birthing pod deck. You're not sacking creatures up a chain. You just sack one creature, which in turn lets you flood the board. So Stormcaller is 1 in a blue. When it ETBs, the next instant or sorcery spell you play this turn gets copied. So you play your Stormcaller, you play your Neoform, you sack your 2-drop, and then every subsequent copy of Neoform essentially reads, fetch a 3 CMC creature and put it on the battlefield.
Oh, wow. Okay. All right.
And the 3 CMC creature that you fetch is a card called Dualcaster Mage, cousin to Snapcaster. Dualcaster is 1 red for a 2/2 when it ETBs copy instant or sorcery. So now, when Dualcaster hits the board, it sees this revised version of Neoform on the stack and makes another copy of it. And from there, you just keep grabbing your Dualcasters, keep making copies of Neoform, and when you run out of Dualcasters, you start fetching another 3-drop, which is Glasspool Mimic, which is 2 in a blue. When it ETBs, it enters as a copy of any creature you have on the battlefield. So now you're making additional copies of Dualcaster. Basically, in a lot of games, you end up with 8 copies of Dualcaster Mage on the board, and they're all 3/3s. When you find...
Right, because they get a counter from Neoform, which is
Exactly.
worth mentioning. That's the last weird clause in Neoform.
Exactly. So
Okay, and you have to have you run out of Dualcaster mages. I get it now. Okay, you have to have the Glasspool Mimic for more mages.
Exactly. So now you've got these 8 mages on the board. They don't have haste. They're just 3/3s. But you still have 2 copies of Neoform on the stack.
8 mages a week. That's how the song goes, right?
That's right. The classic song by the Beatles.
Beatles.
So in no particular order, you use your last 2 copies of Neoform to grab first a Tuk Tuk Rubble Fort, which is a 3 CMC wall that gives all of your creatures haste.
Perfect.
And then a Combat Celebrant, 3 CMC Human Warrior from Amonkhet that reads, if the Celebrant has not been exerted this turn, you may exert it as it attacks. When you do, untap all other creatures you control after this phase. There's an additional combat phase. Summary. Long story short, you make a bunch of 3/3s, you attack with them. If that first attack wasn't enough, your Celebrant makes it possible to attack a second time.
Okay, so just to be really clear, you have to sacrifice Seagate Stormcaller to make this all work, right? Or you have to sacrifice a 2-drop to make it all work.
Correct.
Okay.
There is an alternative line I will get to in just a moment, but this is your main plan of attack is Seagate Stormcaller into Neoform. It's how 9 out of 10 wins actually play out.
Okay.
There was one game where I had 3 attack steps because I had previously hard cast the Celebrant that stuck around, and then I got to combo off and then get a second Celebrant, so I attacked 3 times in one turn. I still lost because I was playing against mono white life gain.
Oh no.
They had like a 30-point life gain delta against me, so I like swung 3 times and got them to I think like 10 life, and then they killed me.
As they
I
should
wish I
have.
felt bad.
Yeah.
You shouldn't. I did this to myself. There are 2 other lines I'm going to mention very briefly because they don't come up as often, but they feel awesome when you pull them off. One is with a single Gilded Goose, 2 copies of Neoform, and access to 4 mana. You can sack the Goose to get a Stormcaller, and then sack the Stormcaller with your second Neoform. That feels good. And you can do that on turn 3 because you can use your Goose to tap that with a land to cast that first Neoform, and then you still have the 2 mana up to cast the second Neoform once your Seagate Stormcaller hits the battlefield. The second line, if you have any 2-drop on the board, and you have a Dualcaster Mage in hand, and a Neoform in hand, and 5 mana up, you can cast the Neoform, hold priority, cast your dual caster. You're not sacking your dual casters because the Neoform has already sacked whatever 2-drop you had on the board previously, which could be a Paradise Druid. It could be a Seagate Stormcaller that you may have cast for value or just to like put a body down. Like I said, these don't come up nearly as often as the classic 1-2 punch.
So what are you doing to try to draw through your deck to get to your payoffs? Are there any kind of cantrippy cards, or what's that suite like?
This was my big question as well. Like, what else is in this deck?
I mean, he's named a lot of cards, to be clear. Like, I mean, it stacks up to a full deck pretty quick when you're like, I gotta have 4 Mimics, I gotta have 4 Dual Casters, I gotta have 4 Neoforms, I gotta have 4 Stormcallers. Like, that's
right.
Stacking up fast. So there's not a lot of room.
And you got 2 Tuk, and you got 2 Celebrants. Love casting Tuk. What a fun name for a card. So it has some very important cards that makes this combo so much more consistent. And why I say so much more consistent, I say this combo is really, really consistent. Because the version that I was playing, which had a nearly 60% win rate in Best of 1 on Untapped, runs 4 copies of Wishclaw Talisman. 1 in a black artifact. Enters the battlefield with 3 wish counters on it. Pay a generic mana, tap, remove a wish counter from the talisman, search your library for a card, put it in your hand, shuffle your library. Your opponent gains control of Wishclaw Talisman. Activate this ability only during your turn. You guys ever played with or against this card?
Maybe?
Yes, one or 2 times.
It rules. What an amazing card. Most of the time, it just reads, fetch a card, give this to your opponent, and that's it. And your opponents,
Game over.
Your opponents are never cashing it, A, because they're afraid to give it back to you, or B, you're using it to combo off on that turn, so it doesn't matter that they have it for a turn.
Right.
People are scared of this card. Really funny. Puts you into some very interesting positions as well that can, in some cases, actually reward you for understanding what your opponent is doing. So there were games where I would just crack it the first time, knowing that I couldn't win that turn, but basically counting on the fact that my opponent could fetch anything in their deck and it wouldn't make a difference because they don't necessarily have something that could like win on the turn for them or disrupt me substantially. So that's one way to get through the deck, Dave, to answer your question. The other way is 4 copies of Shimmer of Possibility. 1 in a blue sorcery, look at the top 4 cards, put 1 into your hand.
Impulse. This is Impulse, but it's sorcery speed. Okay.
You also have a couple copies of Into the Royal, not technically a cantrip, but it can kick to be a cantrip, which is very real. Like, this deck has 4 copies of Paradise Druid, it has 4 copies of Gilded Goose, so you have like ramp in there. So sometimes you're playing your 4 mana Into the Royal on turn 3.
Are you running like, so I'm looking at some lists right now. Was the list that you were playing, were you running Opt even or no Opt?
So I was not running Opt. I was not running Wall of Blossoms, which comes up sometimes. Sullendy Visions, Valakut Exploration. I've seen some
You were
lists
not
with
running
Uro.
Valakut Awakening.
No.
No?
No.
No. Wow. Okay.
None of those. I was just all in on the combo, 4 Talisman, and 4 Shimmer of Possibility. It also, like I mentioned, you've got 8 mana dorks with Druid and Gilded Goose.
Yeah.
So deck is awesome, with an asterisk. In Best of 1, Untapped has this deck at about a 59% win rate. In Best of 3, I've seen it go down to 49%. I've seen some versions sub 40%. The deck is practically unplayable after sideboarding because it is so easy to hate out. Gets a ton of splash hate from goblins because Grafdigger's Cage just shuts down Neoform.
Yeah.
And people main deck Grafdigger's Cage, so it makes Into the Royal super important. And because this deck runs main deck Into the Royals and Wishclaw Talisman, sometimes you can fetch your way out of a sticky situation and still win. But the fact that so many decks are playing Grafdigger's Cage in this format because of how good it is against goblins and other strategies as well, Neostorm gets punished for that too. Authority of the Consuls. 1 mana enchantment, sees playing auras as well as some white-based control decks, makes it impossible to attack the turn that you combo off, potentially opening you up to a Wrath as well because Authority reads creatures your opponents control that enter the battlefield enter tapped. Hushbringer also sees playing auras, basically shuts down all of your wizard ETBs. Hushbringer says creatures do not have ETB effects.
You gotta have those wizard ETBs.
You need them for this deck. And then, of course, Mystical Dispute, it counters both Neoform and Stormcaller. And because this deck is so mana hungry, it's trying to combo off on turn 0-4, you never have the mana to pay that 3 CMC tax.
Are you still seeing a lot of Mystical Disputes? I feel like a lot of decks are shaving it recently. Like, it doesn't have the power that it seemingly used to, or at least in Historic.
I'm not seeing a lot of them, but I see them periodically because sometimes people even play a main deck in best of one.
Yeah, I'm surprised. It's a card that hasn't made it in the sideboard of my Auras deck when I feel like it's a card I definitely put in like blue-red prowess all the time. You know, either deck could run it, but they're not in Historic. So
here's the other thing I got to say about best of one versus best of three, which kind of speaks to the arena client in general. Best of one has a hand smoothing effect where, and this is not conspiracy. Everyone knows this. Wizards is honest about this. When you play best of one Magic on Arena, the platform draws 2 hands for you and then gives you the hand with the best spell to land ratio. So in effect, when you're playing Neostorm in best of one, you almost never have to worry about your mana because you're always going to have like at least 2 to 3 lands to just get the ball rolling. And I think that's really significant, where in best of 3, in some cases, it becomes almost like a 3-card combo because you need your Neoform, you need your Stormcaller, and you need the lands to do it. Best of 1, you're never worried about the mana. On the other hand, it sideboards really nicely. And I've won a bunch of games where I had to mull to 6. I've won no shortage of games where I mull to 5. I've once won of a mull to 4, with just like 2 lands, the 2 combo pieces, and then eventually drawing into a ramp and another land.
Stan, you said it sideboards nicely. Didn't you mean mulligans nicely?
I did, thank you.
Because you're playing best of one with this, right?
I have played a little bit of best of 3, and that's actually where I tried experimenting with some Uros that I happen to have in my collection. And we were talking about whether or not Uro can slide into any Simic deck. Uro basically has no place in the version of the deck that I played because I am not filling up my graveyard at all. There's a ton of games where I just win on turn 3 or 4 with an empty graveyard because I'm not playing the fetch land. I'm not playing Fabled Passage or Evolving Wilds. I'm just playing land, Gilded Goose, combo off, and that's it. And in this deck, at least, I found there are some attempts at best of 3 where I tried to side it in Uro because I thought maybe the game was going to go long, maybe they're going to bring in some hate against me, but that Uro just basically read as like a 3-mana Explore, and I don't think it's really good enough at that rate.
So Stan, what do you think about this? Is your new favorite deck?
Yeah.
Is this everyone should make this immediately?
I don't know that it's for everyone, but I loved playing this deck. I loved it a lot more than playing Goblins. And I kind of just want to compare it to Goblins briefly. I did find that the turn 3 and 4 kills are more consistent here because you're more all in on that combo win. Goblins has Matron, so it does have, some version of redundancy, but this has more cantrips. In addition to more tools to combo off. You can have those other lines, whereas Goblins just has Muxus. On the other hand, Goblins has a plan B. Like, it can beat down, it can beat a cage. This deck is almost never beating a resolved or an unanswered cage. So where you maybe lose plan B, you get a little bit more speed and you get a little bit more consistency for the combo plan.
Sweet.
So are you just going to run this out like all the time in best of one now and see how far you can go? Or are you still playing it? Like where are you at as far as enjoyment goes?
I'm enjoying it a lot more than Goblins in best of one. I think I have I'm high plat 3 right now. I've been like teetering in platinum 4 with every other deck I was playing. Once I picked up this deck, I started climbing again. I think I might be able to make a run for diamond. And I think I'm going to just keep going. I got a couple 7-win events, best of one events in this. The best of 3 events are so much harder for the reasons I mentioned. And as a result, like the best of 3 ladder is so much harder. So I have to do it slowly, but I think I could be a little bit more consistent best of one. But I also just love playing the deck. I love giving people the good game the turn that I start to combo off to try to encourage them to concede.
Don't do that.
Monster.
I
have to.
Yeah.
I mean,
You're an extra monster now.
I have the win. It's like you can watch me click 10 times or you can just accept defeat.
Well, it's awesome, Stan. I'm glad you got a new best of one deck that you love playing.
I do. I think this is going to tide me over until Kaldheim releases, and I have to buy some more packs. But
So remember how fast we are gonna do that? I think you easily took as much time as I did.
Untrue.
Easily.
I have
Totally
a stop.
easily.
Nope. I have a stopwatch going here, Shane.
How
It's
far?
not true.
How far ahead was I?
10 more minutes.
No, you're kidding me.
Nope,
I talked for
I'm-
38 minutes.
I think you talked for 30 minutes and Stan talked for 18.
No, it stands at least
Nope.
23.
We're not doing this on air.
listen, I'm young. I can move a little faster.
Yeah.
I got longer legs. But my two dads, stop fighting.
Yeah, right?
I want to hear Dave, the Godfather.
Daddy Dave.
I want to hear about Racksack.
Yeah, guys. We got to talk about the other giant meta deck that we've never spoken about on this, and that literally I had never played against, maybe one time, until I picked up this deck, and then it felt like Arena paired me against it every single match for like 2 days. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about Rakdos Sacrifice. And here's what I have to say about this deck is that I'm last, but I think this deck is first. I think this deck is unreal. Okay. And I don't even think I'm good at it, but this deck has got a lot going on with it. And it's got a lot of power. So basically, after playing blue-white for a while, I wanted to try to learn one of the higher up meta decks. I could have got Sultai. I could have got, blue-white control or something like that. But I really felt like that I wanted to play a Thoughtseize deck, which it turns out this isn't really a Thoughtseize deck. Yeah. But I also like that the kind of graveyard synergy that's going on here and has a little bit more kind of technical play to it than what Aura's has, which while it has a lot going on, there's so much to manage with this deck that I just really thought this would help me give a good perspective into Arena and Historic. And so I picked it up recently. And have you guys ever read Cauldron Familiar and Witch's Oven? Have you seen these cards?
Yeah.
Have you seen them?
Dave?
Okay.
Believable. How could these cards have been in the same set?
Same set. Why not?
You know why? I'll tell you why. It's because you can only tap Witch's Oven once per turn. That's why.
Yeah, that's not... Yeah, that's a problem. Okay, so what is this deck? So if you haven't seen this deck, you haven't played it, you haven't played with it, Sacrifice is a Rakdos deck, sometimes Jund deck, that focuses on very specific synergies that you can get from sacrificing a lot of different permanent types. Weird to say, but that's what it is. It's mostly sacrificing creatures, but occasionally there are other things as well that you get to do that you get triggers off of. And the truth is, I think that this is this is kind of like a grindy aggro deck that has all these kind of microtransactions and lines of play that allow you to adapt your plan a little bit to where it needs to go. So it's all about managing triggers, playing to the board, playing against creature decks. As was mentioned on a Arena deck list a couple of weeks, and they did a huge dive down into this deck, which you should listen to because they're much smarter than us. They said that in a meta where there aren't a lot of creature decks, this deck would not be very good. And I think that's pretty true because it gets a lot of edge from just devouring decks that rely heavily on creatures to be their payoffs.
Yeah. Eats them alive. Just Gruul against this deck is so hard. You have to draw perfectly.
It literally eats them alive. And so we'll talk about that in a minute. But so if I would boil this deck down to one interaction, it's what I was just talking about a minute ago, which is the cat oven. Take the cat, put it into the oven. That is the whole axis that this deck is built around. And so in case you haven't seen it, aren't familiar with how it works, Cauldron Familiar is 1/1. It's a cat. It costs a black mana. When it enters the battlefield, you do a drain gain trigger. Okay? This is important. And then it says sacrifice a food, return Cauldron Familiar from your graveyard to the battlefield. And then the other side of this coin is Witch's Oven, which costs a single colorless. And it says tap, sacrifice a creature, create a food token. If the sacrificed creature's toughness was 4 or greater, create 2 food tokens instead. That is it. And what this does is unreal. What have we said in the past about sacrifice abilities that do not require mana?
They're good.
And even when they require tapping, they're always going to find a way to be used. And this is just such a good indication of that. This whole deck, honestly, is built around this interaction, I think. So it's 2 highly synergistic 1-drops that make a loop. So you have a cat, sack a cat to the oven, get the benefits of the sack triggers. Then you have a food. Then you sack the food to the cat's ability, which is at instant speed and
Yeah,
doesn't cost any mana.
The text is just sacrifice of food.
Yep, that's all it says. And then you get Cat's come into play ability, and then repeat as much as you can. Do it all the time. Click a lot. It's unreal when you have multiple witches ovens out and one cat, because you'll do this 3 times a turn.
Yeah, so it's like, I mean, this basic engine was part of Eldraine Standard, I believe, because I remember playing against it a lot when I was doing Arena months ago, and now it's back here doing the same thing. It's like when I always play aggressive creature decks.
Right.
So like, you know, one of the things I'm sure you'll talk about, Dave, is like you can block with the cat, sack the cat, get the food, end of turn if you want to get the cat back. There's some reasons you might not want to get an end of turn. There's like you keep that annoying blocker, you're gaining life, you're draining me.
Yep. And here's the list of what it does. It lets you pack in for damage through the drain. It lets you slowly recover from aggro plans because you gain life every time you do it. It provides death or sack triggers that do other things in the deck. It lets you chump block indefinitely. There's so many different things that you can do, and when you do it and fire it off makes a big part of it. So what the deck does, I think, is it takes this interaction and builds an entire shell around it. Right. So what you end up with is a core where sacking permanents and creatures is good, and you find ways to maximize it. So,
Dave, would you say sometimes sacrificing permanents can be good?
Can be good. Yeah, exactly. You know, one of the main things you want to do, so that's the first thing you should do. You build a core where you get triggers, you get paid off for sacrificing creatures and permanents. The second thing that you do to build off of that is build a core where, because when you have creatures dying, you want to find ways to bring them back. You build a plan where filling the graveyard is good, either because you're bringing permanents back or because because that's a place that essentially extends your hand. And then you use these 2 assets to kind of take advantage of a couple of special cards that help pay it off even more. So that's kind of the way I think about this deck. There's like the sack trigger payoffs, there's the graveyard part of it, and then there's the kind of bonus cards. So I'm going to go really quickly through those 3. So when you're thinking about this deck and you're thinking about playing against this deck, you can kind of try to figure out which part of their plan you want to disrupt. You want to make it hard or bad for them to sack creatures with that pig, for example? Do you want to attack their graveyard, which, you know, is a less powerful axis against them, but still helps a lot because they can't reuse things? And then just a couple other things to keep in mind. So how do you make sacrificing good? 2 huge payoffs in the Rack-Sack deck make sacrificing things good. And we're going to start with the less impressive one first. And that is Midnight Reaper, which is a 3/2. It is from... Which one is that from? It is from Guilds of Ravnica. It's a zombie knight. It's a 2 colorless and a black. And the text on it says, whenever a non-token creature you control dies, Midnight Reaper deals 1 damage to you and you draw a card. So this is this idea where, you know, whenever you sacrifice a non-token, you get to draw a card. And it happens all the time in this deck, constantly. I've had games with this deck before where I had Cat and 2 or 3 ovens and a Midnight Reaper out, and I'm just drawing 3 cards a turn. Just drawing 3 cards and playing 3 cards a turn and just kind of going.
If I recall correctly, Dave, you enjoy drawing cards, right?
I love drawing cards. Yeah, that's why I wanted to start with this one, even though it's not as good as the other payoff. So in cases where you do have Cat Oven, you get to draw a loop. When you don't have Oven, you get to do other stuff because there are other sacrifice outlets within this deck for sure. And that's important because Oven's not the only sacrifice outlet, but we'll get to those in a little bit. So payoff number 1, sack creatures to draw cards. The second one is key payoff is Mayhem Devil, which is, I don't even know how this card is
Bonkers card.
Yeah, so it's a 3/3 for 1 colorless red black that says whenever a player sacrifices a permanent, Mayhem Devil deals 1 damage to any target. That's it. So what I missed when I read this was whenever a player sacrifices a permanent. Yep. So if your opponent sacrifices something, you get to ping.
Treasure tokens.
It does.
Food tokens.
Yeah, treasure tokens.
Seagate Stormcaller.
Yeah, Fabled Passage.
Yep.
If you tap a Fabled Passage, they get a draw card. The other thing is any target. Okay, I didn't really miss this, but how good this is really hard to overstate. That you can hit planeswalkers, you can hit their creatures, you can hit them. And so what you have in Mayhem Devil, the games when you have Mayhem Devil out on the board are fundamentally different from the games where you don't. And the moments in the game when you do get it out, you often can close the game pretty quickly from there because it multiplies the damage that you're able to do, or it gets you out of a tight situation where you're just like, well, I play Mayhem Devil on turn 3 against goblins, and then I do a couple of cat loops, and then I clear their whole board because they have a bunch of 1/1s and they can't have those on the next turn to try to ramp with.
Well, not only that, but they can't necessarily ramp off their own Skirk Prospectors because that's sacrificing goblins, which is then triggering the Mayhem Devil.
Yeah, it does do that. I found that when I'm playing against goblins with this, I want to kill their creatures as much as possible. Like, that's how I feel like the best way to get through goblins is to just keep their board clear so they don't get any extra benefits from stuff. So I'm like proactive there. I'm like, get out of here. So it's huge, right? So these are the cards that pay you for extra for sacrificing things. There's one more that I'll talk about later, but the second part is we built a graveyard deck, right? So
who's we?
That's my favorite Tom Hanks 80s movie.
Yeah, it is. It's perfect. It's Cameron Crowe's real fall from grace is we built a graveyard deck.
I don't know. I thought that movie was pretty good.
Oh, really?
ScarJo, Matt Damon, two of America's most charming actors.
Power couple. It's true. The cat was weird. Who they cast to be Cauldron Familiar. I wasn't expecting it to be Salem from Clarissa or whatever. Not Clarissa. What was that called?
Sabrina the Teenage Witch. With Clarissa.
Right, exactly. All right. So anyway, the graveyard deck. So this is familiar to people, right, from modern play patterns where it's like get some cards into your graveyard to be able to get paid out for it. The big card that helps you with this in this version of the deck is Stitcher's Supplier, right? Where you play it, you mill 3 cards in your graveyard, you sacrifice it to something, you put 3 more cards into your graveyard. You get paid out by doing this because you have a card with Escape, a card that can activate to come back out of the graveyard, and also Cat can come right back out of it. So getting Cat in the graveyard is a way to get to your combo piece where you can draw Witch's Oven, but you don't have a Cat yet, so you try to mill to it. So hands, I think, where you have Oven are a little bit better, of course, than ones where you have Cat, right? Because one combo piece is much better than the other one by itself. So let's talk about the simple cards. So the Escape card that really helps here is Woe Strider, and that card is whoa. You know what I'm saying?
The
lowest. It's another 3/2 for 3. It brings an 0/1 goat token in, and it has the Viscera Seer ability, which is sacrifice another creature, scry 1. It can't sacrifice itself. But it also has Escape for 3 black. It comes back bigger after Escape, which is nice. And actually a potent threat sometimes when you're really kind of grinding out a game. But the big part here is it's another sack outlet. It brings in more than one body, and it lets you scry to be able to find pieces when you need it. And it has Escape, so it comes back, so it pays you out for your graveyard plan. You also have Scrap Heap Scrounger, which is like everyone's favorite recursive beater. It's a great card. I kind of think it's one of the worst cards in this deck, honestly, because it's kind of clunky. You're not really trying to run this plan. Of course, you have the Cat, Cauldron Familiar here as well. And then finally, some people run Croxa. The list I've been running does not have any Croxas in it. But I've definitely seen some wild things playing against this deck where someone plays a Croxa and then sacrifices the Croxa to something else in response to the sacrifice trigger and gets all this value.
Hey Dave, where's your Bomat Courier?
You know what? My list is not running it, and many of the lists are not running that card. And I wonder sometimes if it should be in this over Scrap Heap Scrounger, for example.
You know who would tell you yes?
Who's that?
The host of Arena Decklist.
Oh, was he into that? I forgot about that from that discussion.
That's kind of like their heads up play, is that it just helps shore up some of the matchups where you're struggling.
Yeah, I believe it. I mean, were they playing it over Scrap Heap Scrounger? Do you remember?
I think over Stitcher's Supplier. I think they found Stitcher's to be a little mopey.
I agree with that. And I think the one thing that I'll note really quickly, because we are kind of running a little bit on time, is that in the Jund deck, fundamentally the difference between this deck and the Jund deck is that the Jund deck runs Collected Company over Stitcher's Supplier.
Right.
So all of these things, in a way, are kind of like draw engines, right? Bomat Courier is, Stitcher's Supplier is, and Collected Company is. The list that I've seen at the top of the ladder win percentage-wise still have Stitcher's Supplier, but depending on how you look at the metrics on the ladder, sometimes Jund is much higher than Rakdos, sometimes it's the other way around. But I could definitely understand working with the Stitcher's Supplier slot, or like I said, the Scrap Heap Scrounger slot, where sometimes I was like, I just want a different card here.
I'm remembering now, their whole point with those two artifacts over Stitcher's Supplier is that they're basically color fixing for you because they're colorless.
Yeah.
So you don't have to worry about like having the actual right mana while you're working towards your engine.
Yeah. And, another card that people run in here that's more of a payoff card than anything else is Dreadhorde Butcher, which is something that I didn't get a chance to try out, but it's a 2-drop that has haste that every time it hits an opponent, it gets +1/+1. And then when it dies, it does damage equal to its power to any target. So that's another card that can be good in that same kind of slot, depending on what you want to do. All right. So got a couple of cards to talk about to finish this up. And that is basically the payoff cards that fit in with this too are Priest of Forgotten Gods, which is like the most text I've ever seen on a 2-drop. I think. Do you guys know what Priest of Forgotten Gods does? Can you recite it without looking?
I know you have to sacrifice 2 creatures.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's tap, sack 2 creatures,
Does it make black mana?
Yeah.
and your opponent sacks a creature.
Yeah.
Oh.
Except it also draws you a card and does 2 damage to your opponent. So when you tap it, you lose 2 creatures, but you draw a card, you get black mana, it does 2 damage to them. It's unbelievable amount of copy on a card. And it's amazing.
I mean, you have to sacrifice 2 creatures. That's supposed to be a downside.
Yeah, but in a deck that's made to sacrifice things, you obviously are going to find a way to turn it into an upside. And this is the kind of one of the main reasons that this deck can be so good against like aggro strategies, specifically like auras, where they have one big threat or anything that's one big threat. You can just make them sacrifice their board.
Is this Faithless Looting?
I mean, a little bit. It's definitely slower than that, but it does some wild stuff. And there are some games that just really turn on being able to get Priest of Forgotten Gods out and active at the right time.
Right. I mean, Priest, whenever I play against Sack, I feel like Priest is the must kill. Or it's like, I have to either bounce it or kill it while it has Summoning Sickness, because as soon as it's online, it just takes over. It's like, in some ways, to me, it feels like the linchpin that makes the deck so scary, because the cat oven combo is kind of slow.
I actually think Priest is really slow too, and it's especially weird in the mid game where you have to like play it and then wait a turn to make it work. But you can always give it haste with Claim of the Firstborn. That's something that I did the other day in a league that was pretty amazing and won me a game for sure. So speaking of Claim of the Firstborn, that's the next card. That's a great payoff that this deck gets to play. A few other decks also play this card, but Claim of the Firstborn, it's a 1 CMC threaten for creatures that have less than 3 CMC.
There's no of. It's just Claim the Firstborn.
Oh, so just Claim the Firstborn? Sorry. Yeah, Claim the Firstborn. So yeah, we're taking the Firstborn. It's not getting claimed by the Firstborn. Understood. So this card is amazing in this deck, right? Because it's a 1 mana removal spell. It gives you a sack trigger. You get to kind of bash in with whatever creature they have with it. Against some decks, that's totally wild. Like against auras, for example, you grab their Spirit Caller or whatever and just like swing in and just hit them. And then they're pretty much dead because you took their 16/16. But, it's super on plan. It's super synergistic with the deck. Like I said, sometimes you got to remember is to give your own creatures haste. Shane, I see that you had a question that the reason it's playable is because of Uro. That's not true.
You don't think so? You think it's just good enough?
I think it's just good enough in the deck. Honestly, I was kind of skeptical about it at first from just reading the list, but that's I think that's kind of like overblown. It's too good.
Claim?
To not have it. Yeah, Claim.
Remember your co-host Shane Beeps did pick to click this card.
Oh yeah, I remember. I would have picked it too. I mean, it's a 1 mana spell that has a pretty powerful effect.
Oh yeah, it's good.
And then of course, Phyrexian Tower is super useful. Sometimes you just want it for ramp. Sometimes you want it for an extra sacrifice trigger, but that's what it is. So look,
Dave,
there's just a lot to think about with this deck. There's a lot of triggers. You have to think about when to ping things, when to fire off your loop, when to grab their creatures, which creature to grab. Like I mentioned, I haven't used the Coco version that plays Coco and Corvold sometimes. I haven't tried Dreadhorde Butcher, but I think this deck is really, really very good. And I think it's more powerful than something like Auras and more consistent because it just has more lines of play. Although, Auras is still a very good deck. I'll probably alternate back and forth between this and Auras, as I try to ladder for the rest of the way up. It's more just like this is kind of laddering on hard mode, I think, because even though I think this deck is more powerful, it's just there's so many ways to mess up.
Yeah.
But it's gone okay so far. I think I have 10 matches in. I'm like 8-2 or something like that. So it's going fine.
Wow.
80% win rate. You hit it here first.
Just a casual 80% win rate. I think the deck is fine.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, when I messed up really badly. Let's say.
Is this what you played on day 2?
No, I played auras
Okay.
all the way through that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you like it?
So we just talked about like the top end of the meta. We talked about Sultai. We talked about this deck. We talked about Neostorm as kind of like the best of one killer. How do you want to close this out?
Well, how do you guys feel about Historic? I mean, I think we've been talking about it. We've been playing it a lot. I've got a lot of matches in on it. I think it's a surprisingly good format. Like, it doesn't suck. There's some cards I think are better off out of the format, but I mean, every format always has those crazy cards that you don't want to see that often.
I think it's buoyed by the quality of Arena.
I was kind of thinking the same thing in some ways.
You think if we were playing Pioneer, we'd be like even happier or something?
Maybe not Pioneer specifically, but
Yeah. So here's Shane. You said something about Sultai that I've been sitting on. Every game feels the same for you, or like a lot of games are very samey.
Yeah.
And maybe that's because like first I played Goblins, then I played Neoform. Before that I played Mono Blue. Before that I played Mono Red. But I feel like more often than not, that's the case with a lot of Historic decks.
I think it's just I think it's the case with a lot of Magic decks.
that was what I was wondering too, a little bit. Yeah.
Like that's the reason that they're good, right? Is because you have like many similar effects. You have many cards doing the same kind of thing. You have you want to create that inevitability. You want to be able to do it reliably, and like that's just what happens, right?
But we don't necessarily feel that way when we play Modern.
I think a lot of modern decks do feel that way. I mean, I think like there's certain decks that don't. Like Burn feels the same, but Humans doesn't, because like the way Humans interacts with the board or the hand does different things, right? Like, but Prowess feels pretty, similar, or to me at least. It's just like there's different decks I think that want to do the same thing. Like, Control wants to keep the board clear, wants to maintain their life total, wants to stick a Planeswalker, generate a lot of value out of it, that kind of stuff. And Jund wants to do the strip the hand, remove the things, stick the Goyf, take over the game with that type thing. And I think it's just like that's what Magic is about in a lot of ways. I think there's just decks that make it more palatable for you to do the same thing over and over again versus others.
I mean, I kind of agree with both of you, where it's kind of like, yeah, I'm enjoying it. It's fun. I do think it is a little bit buoyed by the fact that like Arena is a pretty whizzy experience. My technical problems on day 2 aside, it's also a bit easier to just pick up and go, like I've talked about a couple of times. And also it's new for me. And so I'm enjoying the newness of it. These are cards that I haven't spent a lot of time playing with. And so, I know there's a lot of factors to make me feel like I'm pretty positive about Historic. I like the fact that it's going backwards and forwards in time at the same time, like you said.
Yeah, that's really cool.
And that's not going to last forever. But I think I feel pretty good about it overall. I mean, for as much as everybody's like, these Uro decks, these Sultai decks are 30% of the meta, 35% of the meta, or whatever, it's like, it's a drag to play against them. But once you figure out a plan against them, it feels like you can start to increase your win rates some. So I don't feel terrible about it, but I enjoy it. I've been enjoying it. I'm still enjoying it. Stan, are you still enjoying it? A couple weeks ago, you were pretty into it.
Oh yeah, I love it. I mean, I think it helps that I got the shiny new deck that I really like playing. I think
that is always fun to get new decks, and we'll run out of that.
Yeah, we might, and we don't have mana traders, so I hope we don't hit a dull brick wall. I think that might be kind of crappy because in theory, this could get boring sooner than Modern and MTGO can, because there's like a limit to the experiences that you can have on Arena, or at least until you start playing like Arena Cube and the weekend only events and Historic Artisan Brawl.
Yeah. I mean, I think there is something to be said about ladder. You know what I mean? Like, it's not an event. I don't have to spend 500 gold or, 1,000 gems, something like that. Like, there's literally no investment but my time and my pride.
It's just free real estate.
Yeah. It's funny to me, like, shame to admit it, but the pride part is actually like hard for me. So
yeah, ladder anxiety is real, man.
I would rather like mess around in a league for 500 gold and feel like I'm on it and then go back to the ladder than the other way around.
Is this feels versus reals? But I feel like my win rate is better in events than it is on the ladder.
Might be. I definitely feel like I see more brews in the
events
than I do on the ladder.
Yes. Well, Historic is fun. Arena is maybe more fun. We'll keep
Bring Modern to Arena. Do it.
Yeah, that's the dream. That's absolutely the dream. I guess we'll keep playing
Give you
it.
$1,000.
Yeah, right. How am I going to build my deck?
I was serious. I'd do it. No question.
What should we do next week?
Just give me all of Modern.
Should we just buy 3 new decks?
Yeah, we're going to all buy Modern decks next week.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. This was fun while it lasted, but that does wrap up this week's show. If you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe to the podcast. Get the latest episodes as soon as they come out. If you use Apple Podcasts, please consider leaving us a rating and a review. If you'd like to submit a question to the show, pick our brain on something in Modern, Historic, heck, Pioneer. We still kind of know what's going on over there because nothing is going on over there. You can tweet us at The Dive Down, all one word, or email thedivedown@gmail.com. You can support the show by joining our Patreon over at patreon.com/thedivedown. You can also support the show by subscribing to Mana Traders with coupon code TheDiveDown. Get 15% off your first 3 months of renting Magic Online cards with Mana Traders. For all you MTGO stands out there. Also go over to untapped.thedivedown.com to download untapped.gg and track your Magic Arena performance on the ladder. You don't even have to pay any money. If you just download that software, it supports the Dive Down. As always, special thanks to the bands Nowhere and Spaceblood for letting us use their music. And until next week, get out there and make more history.